Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Mason, and I'm going to be talking about some of the more recent research my colleagues and I have been doing at the Lincoln Park Zoo in the last, I don't know, 5 or so years. It's funny to say 5 years is recent, but science moves slowly. But I'm going to talk about a research network that my colleagues and I started called UWIN, or the Urban Wildlife Information Network. And what I think that UWIN is really strongly suited for is to start teasing apart these differences that exist both among and within cities so that we can better understand and predict patterns of biodiversity. And I don't think it's a surprise to anyone here when I'm going to tell everybody that we live on an urban planet. Most people live in urban areas, basically in one form or another. And there are more people living in urban areas now than ever before. And of course, this trend is expected to continue. Because of that, and because most people encounter nature where they live, all of a sudden it becomes really important for us to kind of start understanding what nature looks like, basically where most people are located. And while the field of urban ecology is relatively new, maybe starting about 20, I guess 30 years ago at this point, there's still a few general patterns that we've sort of observed across a whole bunch of different studies. Say, for example, if we've got this regional species pool of nice little dots, in urban areas, what we tend to see in general, with a little bit of, in general, I would say, we tend to see fewer species in urban green space, basically. Whereas in more natural areas, quote unquote, if anything is natural anymore, we tend to see greater species richness. That's just one general trend that we see. Why is that? Well, when we sort of when we pave paradise, basically, and start putting up a parking lot, for the most part, we start increasing isolation between habitat patches. This can be both good and bad, depending upon the species that are present within an area. Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you. I forgot to do that. Okay, I forgot to share my screen. Okay, for everyone at the beginning that missed that, this is an opossum. That's a raccoon. We're living in urban areas. Here are some dots, and now we're back. Okay. So we increased fragmentation among habitat patches, and this could be good or bad depending upon the species that are in the area. But in general, one thing that does negatively influence species is that we're reducing fragment size, or just the overall amount of habitat that's available, which for the most part is really strongly negatively influencing wildlife in an urban area. On top of this, we're introducing a slew of new sources of mortality, whether that be cars or introduced predators like cats. But it's not just doom and gloom for the species that we share our backyards with. There's also a whole bunch of opportunities that exist for species, both in terms of things like anthropogenic resources like food and water, whether that be something that we're actually actively going out and providing to wildlife, like say feeding birds as one example, but also things that we just throw out ourselves, like our trash. But then also there's anthropogenic denning sites, things like that. So there are a lot of species that if they can, they want to take advantage of our byproduct essentially. And as a result have succeeded quite well in living in urban areas. If you asked a raccoon, like, do you like people? Of course they would say no, right? How many people have actually seen a raccoon here in Chicago? I have. A few other people have too, right? But for the most part, they don't care about you. They care about your resources, right? They care about the trash in your backyard, the cat food that your neighbor may put out as well, things like that. But we've been doing biodiversity monitoring in Chicago for the last 10, 12 years or so. One thing that we've really started to wonder is basically like, is a Chicago raccoon the same exact thing as an Indianapolis raccoon or a raccoon in Houston, Texas? And for the most part, when I start thinking about questions like that, like I wanted to take just a step back and start thinking about like, well, what is Chicago and how can what we learn in Chicago translate to other places? And if we just look across the contiguous US, I mean, there's a whole bunch of people that live in urban areas, right? And urban areas account for a huge amount of space. But there's only very few cities that are really as large as Chicago. And as a result, like, is what we're learning in Chicago actually going to translate to Urbana-Champaign, or is it going to translate to like Tacoma, Washington, where I grew up, right? These are questions that we should be able to answer, but not with just the data from Chicago, essentially. And while cities scale in predictable ways, we can also make predictions about how wildlife in cities may also scale in predictable ways. For the most part, most urban ecological studies are basically at the within city scale. You go out and you study biodiversity in Phoenix, and then you write a paper about it, right? And so a lot of questions that urban ecologists are really well versed to address are at that within city scale. And so they can ask questions about how patch size or green space type, like, is this a city park? Is this a cemetery? How does biodiversity vary between those two types? You can ask questions about socioeconomics, things like that. But if you start collecting data across cities, you might actually be able to start asking some slightly more nuanced, and I would argue important questions, like, is the amount of habitat in city 1 versus city 2, these two starred cities is Indianapolis and Chicago, does the amount of habitat that's available there, does it actually predict what patterns of biodiversity look like? Or what are the cultural attitudes of these cities? Oh yeah, Chicago and Indianapolis. Like, take for example, Chicago, its area is about half that of Indianapolis, right? But we've got 3 times the population as Indianapolis does. Indianapolis, huge, sprawling. What's that mean for wildlife? What's that mean for biodiversity? Culturally too, I mean, these two cities can't be more different, right? We put different things on our hot dogs. So there has to be something going on here. We haven't tested the hot dog hypothesis yet, but maybe one day we'll get around to it. And when we scale up even further, right, if we're starting to think about differences among regions, there might be differences related to climate, related to human facilitated introductions or land cover. Take, for example, Seattle, Washington. I already said I grew up in Washington State. I like to use Seattle as a wonderful example. It's forested, it's wet. So do patterns of biodiversity in a forested and wet area actually track patterns of biodiversity in an area that's a desert and it's dry, like Phoenix? And really only multi-city studies can actually answer questions at all of these scales, right? Like, certainly we can go out and do a meta-analysis, something like that, get data from a whole bunch of different individual studies, but that can leave, like, there can be so many methodological differences that exist across all these different studies that could actually have an influence on the patterns that you're observing. But if you actually went out and systematically studied biodiversity in all of these different places, right, you could actually be certain that the differences that you find are ecological, not methodological. And that's why my colleagues and I started UWIN. This map is a little outdated. We started with just about 3 or 4 different cities, all in the Midwest. And at this point, we've expanded to, I think, 45 cities, and including some international partners like Berlin in Germany and Cape Town in South Africa. But we do have very great representation of North America, especially. And we use a very common and systematic study design among cities. For the most part, what we're starting with right now, what I'll be presenting on, is that we use motion triggered trail cameras, or camera traps, as ecologists like to call them. And we sample basically wildlife along an urban to rural gradient within each of these cities. We work very closely with partners to make certain that their site selection is actually sampling like an urban intensity gradient. And we, for the most part, place these camera traps in urban green space. So in Chicago, for example, this includes things like golf courses and city parks and natural areas and cemeteries. And you may not think of things like cemeteries as actual wildlife habitat, but you'd be surprised to know that, like, the wildlife diversity that you see in cemeteries actually more closely tracks the wildlife that you would see in a natural area. Whereas in a city park, it's about 1/3 of that. And it's because, like, cemeteries, like, they're only used by people during the day, right? And they're walled up, like they're a wonderful, wonderful resource for wildlife. We've got flying squirrels, for example, that live in cemeteries throughout Chicago itself. Did people know that flying squirrel live in Chicago? Now you do. And this is just 2 examples of study transects from UWIN. So we have to, while we use a systematic study design like Chicago here and Manhattan, Kansas, the other Manhattan, for them to study their urban intensity gradient, all of their transects are maybe about 10 to 15 kilometers in length. Ours here in Chicago, it's about 50 kilometers in length. And it's just because Manhattan, Kansas is a much, much smaller city, right? So they had to run more transects in order to actually get up to a sufficient sample size. But yeah, you can see here that for the most part, our camera traps here in Chicago go to the northwest along the Des Plaines River, to the west along Roosevelt Road, and then to the southwest along the Sanitary and Shipping Canal. And we do have a few, we started a fourth transect going straight to the south. I think it gets, I can't remember how far south it goes, but there's a lot of opportunity to fill into this area if only I had some help for some people that wanted to collaborate with me. Wink, wink. And I'm not going to go into all of the methodological details here. We, of course, do more than just camera trapping. We're trying to, I mean, because camera trapping is really great for assessing patterns in mammals, right? But we're now also starting to do, across all these different cities, things like acoustic monitoring for birds. Or within Chicago itself, we're also doing acoustic monitoring for bats. We've been doing that for a very long time. So we definitely do more than just non-volant mammals. But yeah. But we have a really great open access paper that's just sort of a, hey, this is this new thing that we started. And that has a lot of the sort of methodological nitty gritty if you're really interested in looking at that. When we first started, we had about 7 or so cities that joined us. The cities are, I'm not going to give you the codes for what all these mean, but those are cities down there. And then we can ignore most of this clustering sort of stuff. That's not the point that I'm trying to get across here. But we just made a heat map, basically, of like how common all these different species are across all these different cities. And a few patterns just immediately emerged just from essentially looking at the raw data. And you can all probably see those patterns too, right? Like there are a few specific species that are very common across all these different cities. Things like your common urban animals, right? Your raccoon, your coyote, the white-tailed deer, for example. There's also a few different species that occur across a bunch of different cities, but are just less common, slightly more rare. And that includes species like the woodchuck and the red fox. And then there's a lot of just individual species that are kind of popping up in some cities and not really seen in other cities. Like some people say that we have bobcat in Chicago. We've been monitoring for 12 years. We haven't seen one. So, but I mean, we also have beaver, things like that. But this was just like a single like season's worth of data. I think this was like 2017. And so this was just some of the patterns that we saw with just one, our first effort, basically. And what got me most excited about looking at this figure here was not just the species that we saw in a couple different spots, it's this specifically right here. Because we've got these very, very common species, but you can actually see that there's variation in how common these species are in just these 7 different cities, right? So let's see, ININ, that's Indianapolis, Indiana. So purple is basically 100%, right? So raccoon everywhere, whereas in Austin, Texas, raccoon not everywhere. And that really started some questioning that I had. It's like, well, how do we predict these differences, right? Can we actually, like, as a city becomes more densely populated, for example, does how common these species actually are, like, does that actually change? So do raccoon become less common, or do opossum become more common in a city that's more densely populated? And if we think about this sort of graphically, we can come up with a few different predictions, right? So say we've got a whole bunch of different cities here. The average housing density of a city is on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we've got how common a species is, basically, their average occupancy. So it could be, of course, there might be some species that we don't observe this relationship whatsoever, right? That's certainly a possibility that we need to entertain. There could be some species that have a positive relationship, and these are probably species that we don't like all that much. This could be things like bed bugs and rats. But certainly there are species that are going to fit this bill, right? But with mammals especially, we're probably going to expect to see a pattern that looks something more like this. So the average housing density, as the average housing density of a city goes up, how common a species is theoretically could be going down. But not only that, can we actually, instead of just observing this pattern, can we actually create statistical tools to be able to predict how common a species is in a new city that joins the network, for example? So say for Portland, Oregon just joins UWIN, can we actually come up with a tool that says like, all right, thank you for joining UWIN. You should see raccoon at half of the sites that you actually go out to. Get back to us and let us know. And it's not only just about how common a species is, right? It's also about it's also about where they're located within a city itself too. So it's not just how common in general, but it's like, are you in the urban core or are you outside of the city? So as a city becomes more densely populated, are these species, like say the raccoon, are they in habitat patches away from dense human populations or in habitat patches near dense human populations? And does that strength or the direction of this relationship actually change based on these big landscape level differences among these different cities? Things like how much green space is within a city, or the average housing density of a city. And this is a paper that we put out last year in Ecological Applications. I'm not going to get into the statistical nitty-gritties of this. Suffice it to say that camera traps add in a lot of error basically into your modeling process, because species can just walk right behind your camera instead of ahead of your camera. You have to account for that within your statistical model. But we do find that with species like the coyote, that as the average housing density of a city goes up, they're just about as common the whole way through. So we don't really actually see any variation here. So this is the predicted line across all these different, across quote unquote new cities theoretically. And all these dots here are estimates from, I think, the 10 different cities that were part of this specific analysis. We've got some error bars associated with that too. But it's a nice straight line, right? We do see some other species though. So we've got occupancy on the y-axis and average housing density on the x-axis. That as the average housing density of a city goes up, how common they are goes down. So this would be for the raccoon. I think I've got a couple cherry-picked examples here. Yes, so we've got Manhattan, Kansas, as the place where it has basically the most raccoons. And then Chicago, Illinois, we see raccoons at about half of the sites that we actually go out to. And I'll just say that like the sites that we have here in Chicago, like we are sampling from the heart of downtown Chicago. Like our transects start at Union Station. So, and yes, we do get raccoons like very, very far into the city. So, but it's not just about how densely populated a city is too. We also quantified how much habitat that's available in a city, basically just the proportion of green space through national land cover data sets. And so we actually see, this is actually did not line up with our predictions. We saw as the amount of habitat increased in a city, Eastern cottontail rabbits actually became less common. And like, there's a lot of just so stories for why this may be the case. If I had to guess, it's that in cities that have a lot of habitat, you probably have more predators that can move around much, much more. And species like the Eastern cottontail rabbit can do really, really well with just little pocket parks in people's yards and things like that. Like we have cottontail rabbits all over the place throughout Chicago. Just two examples of this. So we've got Madison, Wisconsin. Doesn't have that much green space overall, but has Eastern cottontails at about half their sites. Whereas in Austin, Texas, they're only at about a quarter of their sites. So these slides here are a little bit more difficult to parse. You can interpret the y-axis here basically as the regression slope term that you get for a species response to urbanization. So say, for example, if a species has a positive slope term, like say right here, then we essentially say that this species positively, its distribution positively covaries with urban intensity of a city. And so that would mean like, say, like you would find fox squirrels in the urban core of a city that has, say, 0.5% green space. Whereas if a city has 0.2 green space, we'd actually say that it negatively covaries with urbanization. And it's this result, while it's kind of difficult to parse out, is probably one of the biggest and most exciting things coming from this study. Because it really is indicating to me that like if we went out and we did a whole bunch of these studies that were isolated, right? If I went out to a city that had 0.6, say, a green space availability, I would write up a paper and say that gray squirrel are positively covariant with urbanization. But then so-and-so et al. Found that it was negatively correlated, right? And we probably wouldn't be talking about how much green space is available within a city. We just say like, there's a lot of disagreement that occurs here and we need to still study that further to figure it out. And this is demonstrating I mean, I wouldn't say clearly because understanding slope terms for models, people have difficulties with this, but it's demonstrating that we're both right? Like, it's not that we're disagreeing with we shouldn't be disagreeing with one another. We should actually be talking about the context of these different cities so we can actually find that generality. So yeah, like if these cities were analyzed as independent single city studies, we'd be inferring dissimilar responses, but only by actually collaborating with one another, by getting all of these different ecologists with very different goals and ideas, like to work together, that we're actually finding that there's disagreements, but they're actually explained by these big, large-scale differences among these different cities. And these results really signify that generality is possible. I mean, that's certainly something that we strive for in the sciences, right? Generality is possible, but only between cities that are similar in some type of regard. So, for example, cities that have similar average housing densities, which means at the end of the day, even if you're writing your own sort of single city study, right? It means that urban ecologists need to do a much better job explaining the broader context of urbanization within their city so that your results can be better understood relative to other studies. If you're just talking about what it was like at your specific sites and you're not actually trying to provide the broader context for what the stage of your city is, right? Then it's going to be very difficult to incorporate into other urban ecological research. Not only that, we can actually, of course, use UWIN to test other prevailing sort of ideas about urban ecological hypotheses. One that we decided to sort of tackle as our next step, I guess, is to look at the luxury effect. Have people heard of the luxury effect before? So it's this idea, it's this long hypothesized idea that basically biodiversity is higher in more wealthy parts of the city, essentially. This was first demonstrated with plants. And then, of course, this has been demonstrated very well with birds. But there are some results that are equivocal. Like you may not find this with mammals, or someone didn't find this with lizards in some specific city. And these results are perhaps confounded by things like how urban a city is in general. And so there was this really great review that came out a couple years ago that even postulated things like, yeah, more urban cities basically are going to find a negative effect, whereas smaller cities are going to find a positive effect, things like that. It may be greater in more arid cities, for example, things like that. So it seems like that the only way, or a great way to be able to address these types of larger scale questions that people write about in the reviews is with a very large and systematic data set from a whole bunch of different cities. By this point, UWIN had expanded dramatically. So the first analysis I shared with you had like 6 cities, then we went up to about 10 or 12. Then at this point, we had 20 cities. And it's not just like people joining the network and then us having 20 cities. It's like people collecting the data, annotating every single camera trap photo, which takes a lot of time. So it takes a lot of work to get up to that point, and it's something that I'm very proud of. There was, I can't see the number, over 100,000 camera trapping days and 4,000 camera trap deployments at 900 sites across all these different cities. Once again, you could see Chicago, Illinois here. Here are some other couple examples from Seattle, Washington, for other sites that are sampled, and then Wilmington, Delaware. Very few coyote on the East Coast. Wilmington doesn't have that many coyote, just one example. A lot of red fox, though. The model that we used here was incorrectly named by my colleague, Chris Sutherland. He called it a multi-region model, but in reality, it is the most excellent multi-city community model for making inference about geographic variation in species richness. I saw this model when it came out and knew at some point I was going to be using it for this multi-city research network. I'm not going to get into the statistical nitty-gritty of this, but I just want to provide some nuance for what this type of tool can provide us. One thing, when you actually start collecting data across a whole bunch of different cities, across a wide geographic range, is that the range of different species varies, right? And so if you you don't want to estimate mule deer locations in the eastern US, or for the most part, Virginia opossum distributions throughout that sort of middle part of the contiguous US right there. And so we need to actually be able to statistically account for the fact that some species may simply just not be present to be able to be sampled within a city. So that's one thing that this model will do for us. This model, the way that we built it, also shares information among cities and species. In other words, it's a hierarchical model that's using random effects. But what it can give us is it gives us species-specific occupancy estimates. So like what's the probability that this species is at a site? But also we can use that to estimate what species richness looks like at all these different locations, which we could then use in a secondary analysis with some caveats to look at, say, how patterns of species richness may vary along socioeconomic gradients within a city, namely per capita income. That's the metric that's been used for the luxury effect. And so that's what we decided to use so we can make a more apples to apples comparison with past research. So let's talk about this figure here. So the main results you actually observe right here. We've got all the cities along the y-axis, and we've got the correlation between species richness and a city's income gradient on the y-axis. These little sort of bell curves are basically posterior distributions from the analysis with median estimates and then 95% credible intervals, and then the full distribution just because it looked a little pretty. But we could see here that if we're comparing, say, no correlation at 0, we found essentially somewhat strong evidence of a luxury effect in what I would say is about half of our cities. And this couldn't be predicted by things like amount of green space within the city, something like that. But we only found it in about half of the cities. And for some cities, this is Indianapolis. Oh wait, no, this one's St. Louis, actually. It's just getting hidden by the screen sharing stuff. So very, very strong correlation that we see here. I believe this one should, maybe Chicago, I can't remember. But then there's other cities like, say, Iowa City, that we don't observe this relationship whatsoever. We also wanted to control for basically how urban a city was, and we controlled for basically how urban each individual site was. And so in addition to sort of correlating species richness, patterns of biodiversity to per capita income, we also correlated it to an urban intensity metric that we compiled from a few different landscape variables, including housing density, green space availability, things like that. And this pattern was something that we expected to see, but not as strongly in all these different cities. But I think it was something 17 of these 20 different cities. We saw very strong and predictable effects, essentially, of urban intensity negatively covariating with patterns of species diversity. And we are, of course, aren't the first people to observe this. This has been something that's been observed in a lot of different studies. This is one of the first endeavors to really show this across a very broad geographic range in a lot of different cities. And what's interesting, of course, is that it's not just that it's all negative, right? But it's also the magnitude of that relationship can vary among those cities as well. This one right here is definitely Chicago because we've got a lot of sites. So we could see that at our less urban areas, so we go out 50 kilometers, like I said. So like imagine like Fermilab out to the west. We actually have pretty high species richness at the urban green space, somewhere on the order of like 8 to 10 species. Whereas in the urban core of the city, it's about half that, maybe about 2 to 3 species. And that'd be your species like your gray squirrels, your fox squirrel every once in a while, and eastern cottontail rabbits. So yeah, we only found really strong evidence of a luxury effect in about half of these cities. And I'm realizing now if that clock is right, I'm speaking really fast, but that's fine. It'll be a short talk. So we only found evidence of a luxury effect in about half of these cities. Why is that the case? And that's something that we're actively trying to research right now. I'm going to share some more recent results from an analysis we've not published yet, but we're writing up at the moment. One thing that could be varying among these cities, essentially, is it's like per capita income is a really rough and rudimentary metric that people have been using. And the only reason that we've been using it is like, one, a lot of really like exciting papers have been published using it, right? So that means that other people want to try to copy that. Ourselves included, like I've done it as well. But it's a really rudimentary metric that doesn't really capture all of the variability that occurs across cities. So my close colleague, Chris Schell, had this really great paper come out in Science in 2020. I highly suggest everyone to read it. It's a wonderful paper, but it really focuses on how things like structural racism and classism can have very strong and bottom-up effects that can structure an entire urban ecosystem. And so if we're using something like per capita income, yes, we can get it from census data, that's great, right? But it's really not going to capture the full pattern that we're actually going to be observing within these different cities. And as sort of our first jump into looking at how this may actually be the case, one question that we wanted to actually start asking was, well, what about patterns of gentrification throughout a city, right? Like gentrification in and of itself is a huge influx of resources to specific areas of cities, which results in like lots of people being displaced, or and so basically, like, do patterns of local diversity within cities vary as a function of gentrification across these different cities, right? Can does the alpha diversity and beta diversity, the community makeup basically of the different animals that we're observing across these different cities, is it changing as a function of gentrification? Gentrification is a term that I feel like everybody talks about, but we don't normally give a standing definition of it. And it's difficult. I mean, I'm not an urban planner, and so there's a lot of different terms that people have used for gentrification. The one that I found that I have most aligned with our research is gentrification is this process of neighborhood change that includes demographic and economic shifts in historically disinvested neighborhoods. And that last part's really important, right? It's not just areas that are rich now, it's the areas that were historically disinvested that have seen this amount of change. And so we used a different metric to say quantify where gentrification is across Chicago. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of how I did that. If people are really interested in that, I'm happy to talk to you about that later. But these sort of gray census tracts are gentrifying areas within the greater Chicagoland area. And then, of course, these are our camera trapping sites. The black sites are the ones that are within 500 meters of a gentrifying census tract, whereas the white ones are the ones that are nowhere near a gentrifying census tract. And so using similar modeling approaches to what we've used in the past, with some extra bells and whistles on it. I always try to like to overcomplicate things. But we sought to see basically while controlling for things like how urban an area is, does patterns of gentrification within the city, does that actually result in predictable differences in how many species are in an area or what the community makeup looks like? Do we just see different species in an area and it's not just about there being more of a species? And the answer to that is, yeah, we actually do see some pretty predictable differences across a lot of these different cities. This is the result from Chicago. That's the one I wanted to share because we're all here. So we can actually see as impervious cover increases within a city, especially at lower levels of impervious cover in gentrifying areas, you got about 2 to 3 more mammal species. And so we're once again using camera traps here. And so this is medium to large mammals from gray squirrel all the way up to coyote, essentially, or white-tailed deer. So yeah, we're definitely seeing a marked increase in the number of species that are living in near gentrifying areas. In terms of beta diversity, so once again, we've got impervious cover on the x-axis. On the y-axis is, can't remember, Sorensen's dissimilarity index. There's so many of them, I can't remember which one I used. But on the y-axis, basically, as this becomes more positive, it means communities are more dissimilar from one another. And so we see that, yes, there is a small difference, but it's really not that big. It's mostly just associated to impervious cover within Chicago itself. But when we actually take a step back and we did this analysis across a whole bunch of different cities, some very interesting patterns that we actually did not include into the analysis at all start to emerge. So these are all the different cities that were included in the analysis. More yellow cities especially that you see on the East Coast here. That's where we're actually seeing changes in alpha diversity as a function of gentrification. Whereas these cities all along the West Coast, which is kind of odd, we're actually seeing bigger shifts in community composition instead of alpha diversity. What this actually means, I don't know yet. We definitely need to dig into this further. If I had to guess, I mean, we definitely developed from the east to the west, and so it's probably something associated to the age of these different cities. And those much older cities on the east have definitely stabilized into something that we're seeing very, very similar differences. A lot of similarities here, whereas these cities are much more similar to one another. Super exciting pattern, but yeah, we definitely need to dig into this much further. And there's other, social ecological things that could be going into play. For example, there might be legacy effects that are driving sort of the geography of development, which could actually be causing shifts in biodiversity. We also need to be talking to people in urban areas, if I'm being honest. Urban ecologist's best friend, aside from a statistician, should be a sociologist, because if we're trying to study urban areas, like people are living in urban areas, and we're doing ourselves a huge disservice by not talking to them and trying to incorporate that information into the types of models that we are using, especially if we're trying to determine whether, like, who's actually receiving these quote unquote benefits from greater levels of biodiversity and whatnot. And then finally, like, we need to actually start just, instead of just treating these species as sort of non-independent from one another, like, what about the traits of these species themselves, whether that be related to how related they are to other members in their community, but also things like how big they are, like their mass, or how much of their diet is other animals, like how carnivorous are they? And we are certainly seeing, I didn't share these results here, but like larger bodied mammals essentially are found on the outside of a city, whereas much smaller bodied mammals are found on the inside of a city. So definitely the traits of the traits of species themselves are going to have an influence on the species that you are going to be observing within and among all these different cities. With that, my thank you slides are getting larger and larger at this point. These are, I need to update this even, but this is all of the different partners that have been gracious enough to join along and help sample wildlife across all these different cities, and have done it for years at this point. I honestly could not be standing here and sharing this without somehow having a lot of these people agree to join in on this study. I'm just amazed by it. And then also, if you're on Twitter and you want to follow me, that's my name. If you want to follow my colleagues and I at the Luna Park Zoo, we use LPZ_UWI. I tweet from that as well, so that's just Mason, just a second time. And then also we have a Twitter for the Urban Wildlife Information Network, which is UWI Network. If you want some more info about UWIN, this website here is where I would direct you to. And then my own personal website not only has links to all of our different articles, things like that, but if you are an ecological modeler and really like statistics, I have a blog post on there for how people can actually be modeling at this level, essentially, to just try to find new ways to model just exciting things in cities. So with that, I'm more than happy to take any questions. Yeah.
So if you want to ask a question, you have to get through a microphone. So you can raise your hand. Also, people online, right?
Yeah, they can unmute themselves.
Okay. So maybe you can signal in the chat. Oh, his mic is on.
Thanks so much.
Your microphone's not on. Is it?
On now. Perfect. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask about, I thought I was kind of curious to have the sampling sites along the river in Chicago. I was wondering if there's a reason for that. Are you doing that in other cities as well? And couldn't that, the closeness to a freshwater source really influence the results? And yeah.
Potentially, and that's one of the reasons why we started sampling not just along two different rivers, right? We have Roosevelt Road as sort of a comparison for that. But you do find, like, I would say in general, especially for mammals, streams and rivers throughout cities are biodiversity hotspots. And they provide corridors, especially for a lot of different species to move throughout them. Say, for example, a possum, they're predominantly just found near natural water sources within the city of Chicago itself. Whereas if you're in the suburbs, they're found all over the place. The reason for that is likely just associated to a shift from green infrastructure outside of the city. You've got drainage dams, things like that. And when the moment that you move into Chicago itself, like it all gets shifted to gray infrastructure, right? And so the opossum in Chicago itself is actually much more like its rural counterpart, whereas the opossum in the suburbs is a little bit different. So yeah, I mean, there could be differences there. Some of our partners do sample along riverways. It's the one thing that's difficult about sampling in urban areas is you need to get buy-in from a lot of different partners in order to actually put camera traps on their land. And so one thing that can make that easier is, like, if you have some landowner that owns a whole bunch of places, like say, for example, along a river, you can do a lot of extensive sampling by just getting like one rubber stamp. A lot of our partners have found it's been difficult to try to continue doing sampling in the long term at some of these different sites, because every once in a while, like a landowner will be like, well, we're done joining the study now. And all of a sudden you're out 15 sites and you need to find a new place. So yes, it could have an influence. But I don't think that any of our partners have specifically looked at variation along rivers and not, though. But it's certainly something that we could do with these data, right? And no doubt we'd actually find a marked increase in species diversity along rivers.
Thanks, that was a great talk. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on kind of the difference between the characteristics of green space in different urban areas versus how they're used by people.
Yeah.
And how that would impact.
Just as one small story associated with that. So, we've been sampling in city parks, cemeteries, golf courses, and natural areas. So the forest preserve system basically throughout Chicago. For a very long time, we actually wrote a paper looking at like how do patterns of alpha and beta diversity vary among these different sites. And that came out, I think Travis Gallo was our old postdoc who led that project. Yeah, we found that like golf courses and cemeteries are actually functionally, even though they look very different, they're functionally similar to a forest preserve to a lot of these different species. Whereas city parks, we're actually seeing, I think the most common community in city parks was no species present, if I'm being honest, which is a community state, right? Like, and a stable one at that, but not one that I would like to see in Chicago. So like in Chicago itself, like especially in new bits of green space when they open up, if you had to ask me, like you will start seeing gray squirrels and cottontail rabbits. And like I bike along the 606. I live in Logan Square. It's a great way for me to get out to the zoo. And the moment that they sort of like recreated that area, there were no species up there. And then within the first couple of weeks, it's like, well, the gray squirrel showed up, and then the cottontail rabbits, and it's like, oh, the things I'm guessing, like I get paid to guess where animals live, and it's nice when they actually agree with me, right? So yeah, like variation in types of green space is definitely something that could be having an influence on patterns of biodiversity. And like we may think of things like golf courses as like, if you're not a golfer, like what a waste of space, right? Like what a great way to ruin a walk. But for a lot of different wildlife that like golf courses are just used during the day, same exact thing with cemeteries. Like there's a lot of resources that are available to wildlife to actually take advantage of those.
Thanks, Mason. That was a great talk. It's so interesting. I'm wondering about like the differences in the characteristics of the built environment and green space. So like the connectivity of green space in a city, and also the the garbage is in the alleys in Chicago, or as it might be on the street where all the people are in other cities.
Yeah.
And then also related to that, like the policy differences. So for example, are dogs allowed in the parks off leash in one city and not in another city? And so things like that.
I mean, from other research, I can like certainly like off-leash dogs can cause differences in terms of activity patterns of different species. Like some mammals may just decide to avoid an area. And then, yeah, with differences among cities, I mean, the one example that comes to mind, especially in terms of like policy planning, and like Chicago has a wonderful alley system, right? We get to put all of our garbage in it and forget about it. Whereas New York doesn't. And then have you all seen that like Orkin comes out with the Radius City thing every single year, and Chicago has been the lead for the last 8 years. I don't think that we're actually the Radius City. Like, Chicago, New York has, gosh, was it 2 or 3 times the population density as Chicago? It's more likely that people in Chicago actually feel ownership of their backyards and their alleys, and they're likely just calling in and reporting to Orkin more because they have ownership of that, right? Whereas if you're actually going out and you're putting your trash on the street, like that's not my problem. That's the street, right? That's a public space. In New York City, I just don't think that they're getting as many calls, because that's the metric that they use, like the number of calls. That's it. They don't divide by population, like anything like that. So it just seems like a very strange metric to get to use. So I don't think I answered all of what you asked. So if you want to talk to me further, yeah.
I'm just curious, in what ways do you think this sort of modeling is going to be benefiting different people, different groups?
So yeah, what's it all mean, basically? What a great question. Yeah, it is that is something that I'm thinking about more and more. And I think this specific gentrification analysis that I'm working on right now is actually helping demonstrate some of those differences. It's like, it's not like, we know that living in areas that have more biodiversity is at least beneficial to our mental health, right? So who's actually benefiting from those quote unquote positive benefits, and who's actually getting sort of ecological disservices? And if I had to guess across all these different cities, nature is not equitably distributed. And so trying to call to light that like all these historical patterns and processes like the systemic racism and things like that are actually like causing differences in the biodiversity that occurs across these cities, and then also who may benefit from them or may come into conflict with them more, is certainly something where we're trying to like draw that light basically.
Is it me? Okay. So I had two related questions. One is that if I put you in charge of the Chicago Park Service or the Forest Preserve, as you said, and you wanted to increase biodiversity, you were telling me a little bit about some of the park designs are basically squirrel habitats.
Yeah.
How would you change some of these habitats such
Yeah.
that they support greater biodiversity? And a related question, if you don't mind touching upon it, is that you told me that you're working also with the Obama Foundation towards monitoring their space. Tell us also a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that a lot of urban green space that people use is essentially turf grass peppered with mature trees, right? And as a result, we've got a lot of species that are really good at nesting in tall, mature trees, and that can make use of habitats that are like constantly disturbed, right? Mowing grass is a disturbance. And so honestly, if we wanted to actually change city parks and things like that to be slightly better, we would let some areas go more natural. Like it doesn't have to be an entire city park to like turn natural, right? Like we need places to play soccer and things like that. But there's some amount of space that we can actually sort of leave more wild that would actually be very beneficial for wildlife, if I'm being honest. But yeah, how much area that you should actually turn to a more natural, like that's a sociological question, right? Because you need to actually go out and talk to people to see like what's the cultural carrying capacity of natural space within a city park. And then yeah, we've also been doing some monitoring out of the Obama Center. We've been sampling in Jackson Park for a very long time. But then also, you know, like when they started building that, we asked like, you know, you guys are going to be doing a lot of work here. Like, how about we set up some bat acoustic monitors and also a whole bunch of camera traps to actually get to see what like this immediate disturbance actually looks like and how things change over time, essentially. Which has been a very fun project to get to work on. We had an intern, Christine Lorenzo, who got to work on that project actually this year, and they got to share some sort of results. I think it was a possum actually, are found like way closer to the Obama Center now than they were like historically, which is kind of a funny thing. Don't know why, but yeah, like we've been doing a lot of monitoring just right in your backyard essentially, because it's walking distance from here. Yeah. Are people asking questions? I guess I should.
No.
Okay, so far no. Okay, cool.
So maybe a last one. Thank you for the talk and the effort to sample all this. In relation to the other questions, there is a sort of a pressing issue with urbanization on the role. What do we mean by diversity in cities? And what would we like to achieve? Because clearly, well, I suppose you are sampling more than mammals, and you know, you have birds and hopefully insects and other things. But ultimately, it's always going to be a very biased sample of what is out there. And that, I mean, at the global level, we will need to have areas where we leave spaces for wildlife. And I think E.O. Wilson had a great proposal for that. The exact number we don't know, but we cannot convert it all to urban or all to national parks. And so the question of what do the urban areas provide besides advantages to us in terms of the bigger picture? It's an interesting question. Does urban ecology should it be better connected to non-urban environment in the thinking about what, you know, how do we manage urbanization? For example, do we want these sites to be corridors or reservoirs for certain, or at least corridors in an increasingly fragmented world? So there is this bigger context for urban, and I wonder whether you can comment on.
So yeah, I mean, urban area, there are going to be some specific species that are not going to be found in any type of urban area, right? There are some species that just do not get along with quote unquote urban environments. And those tend to be lots of species that humans themselves may not necessarily like, or afraid of, I guess I will say, things like wolves and cougars, things like that. And so there has to be space that's made for them, right? That's important. But what I do want to see, essentially, especially with the work that we've been doing, is that cities, like for a long time, have been viewed as like areas where species diversity goes down, right? And I've showed that like with a number of the different figures that we see here, that we from a bunch of different analyses. But like, how can we actually make cities be part of the solution to the biodiversity sort of crisis instead of a big part of the problem? And it's like cities, of course, can't be beneficial to every single urban animal or every single animal, but of those that actually can be found in urban areas, like how can we actually create spaces that are actually like lead to them like coexisting better with us, right? Like, I don't want to say like, let's increase the amount of green space in Chicago twofold. And as a result of that, increase the amount of conflict that we actually have with these species twofold as well, right? That would not be beneficial for those wildlife. That would not be beneficial for humans. A lot of people would be very mad at me if we did something like that, right? So how do we do that in a way that's not going to be increasing conflict, and how do we do that equitably? And those are two things that I think are really, really, I mean, it's probably take my entire career to try to like inch forward towards that, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, there's going to be so many species that I won't even have the opportunity to study because like my field sites is my backyard. But there are still like the amount of biodiversity that occurs across, you know, not just Chicago, but all these different cities is actually just completely mind-blowing and astounding. I mean, like in Texas, like they're picking up ringtail cats and things like that at some of their sites, which is just like cool. Like, I love the fact that like there's just so many just absolutely charismatic and beautiful urban mammals that like so many people will just not even know exist. And they're sharing that city with them. And I think that like telling part of that story so that you know that like these animals are here with you is beneficial. Because like how can you conserve rhinos out in Africa if you don't even care about conserving animals in your backyard?
True, but another view would be to cities be part of the solution by concentrating humans and leaving more land for wildlife. So there are these interesting issues of what green space should do. Yeah.
Oh, they said that maybe we should just concentrate humans.
No, no. What I mean is when we say urbanization, and this is not a joke. I mean, I meant it seriously. Like as we think about urbanization, which is going to take more and more of the planet. So I agree with what you were saying about particular species. But the solution to biodiversity in the big picture is really for cities to concentrate humans and do it in a way that of course is good for humans, but leaves more space for wildlife and creates more. Excuse me?
Yeah, it's urban land cover.
No,
Huge.
right. No,
And so on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
Yeah.
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 You say it better than me. So
No, but you know this, but you're right
I
in terms of
agree.
how is all that managed.
I agree.
Yeah.
How is the support? This is why I was asking, and this is not a criticism, is the question of the planning of urban ecology in the context of the footprint of cities, which is enormous outside of cities.
Right.
And I think that is a real issue. So I'm just raising the issue for discussion.
yeah, I mean, like, because like the footprint of a city, like Chicago doesn't end at the boundaries, right? Like there's so many resources that are getting brought in from outside in order to sustain this huge population. And so it's really difficult to be like, where does the city stop? I don't know. But yeah, it is that's a very important question.
Okay, one more question.
So related to that, I'm wondering if this data set is going to be useful in kind of understanding the resource flows and, you know, I think thinking about like wastewater and kind of exports of cities, as well as kind of the draining of resources and understanding, as you said, kind of that gradient of diversity that maybe is, you different species are more diverse in the city, different other species are more diverse outside and kind of that larger ecosystem.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think like this is more of a statistical endeavor, but one thing that I really hope that this data set could be used is forecasting, right? Because like we're never going to be able to sample every single city, right? And so can we take this data set to actually come up with predictive tools so that we can actually generate species distribution maps informed with the best available data across a wide swath of areas that we haven't potentially sampled? And like, I think this data set is like really useful for that because we have partners that come online and all of a sudden are coming up like generating data. So not only can we be forecasting events into the future, but also doing spatial extrapolation to try to see how well we can actually do, and then improving said models to actually do that better into the future. Like one project that I've been toyingly wanting to start for the very long time here in Chicago is Raccoon Cast, right? We just guess where raccoons live in the next season before we go out. But the reason why I want to start that is like I want to start small and then I want to expand it out to different species and then across the network and build it up to something really, really big, right? Like going and just deciding like I'll just do this really big thing first, like would be impossible. So it's like you got to do things in baby steps. So yeah, I want this to be like hopefully to be a resource that can be something that's like there'd be a generated map for every single city in North America or even the world if we can get enough data to do that, right? Yeah, I mean, can I do it? I don't know. I've got 30 more years of work in me, so.
Wait, there's one question online. So Morgan Gray asked, have you considered pairing weather stations with cameras?
Morgan, I mean, some of our camera traps do collect things like local temperature, but I've been working with, was it Josiah Easter, I believe, at Northwestern. They just moved to a different university, but they've been working really, really hard on like an autonomous like camera trap that records a whole bunch of different information, including things like weather. And maybe we'll get around to getting to test some of that stuff more locally. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of opportunities for pairing camera traps and acoustic recorders with other types of devices so we can actually get a better understanding about not only where species are using habitat, but when species are using habitat. We could, correlate that to things like artificial light at night at very fine scales, or like how noisy the area is in terms of both like humans, but also the things that we use, like our cars, things like that. And so, yeah, it would be a lot of fun to get to do that, Morgan, but haven't done it yet.
Okay. Thank you, Mason. It's a great pleasure. So Mason's here a little bit longer this afternoon. And,